Greetings from the Provincetown Library here in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is the home base for Broto Art Climate Science. We're all about sharing information, and our project seeks to build on the deep roots of both art and science here in Cape Cod. I'm Ian Edwards, and I produce this event. The Broto Affinity program is about examining the relationship, such as it is, between our extractive society and nature, and its implications for climate. As we've developed the Broto experiment, we have built a large community of artists who want a substantive role in the climate challenge. The more I work with this content, the more I'm convinced that art is an underappreciated potential partner in the climate crisis. It's not just that art can provoke or communicate. It's not just about art outcomes. The process of making art can involve original research at the level of inquiry to rival that of our science thinkers. Art process, art making, art distribution. Think about the ability of art to travel the world at scale. Isn't that a model for climate remedies? At Broto, we work on the premise that art can inform science. This is the panel dedicated to that, with artists explaining to everyone else their unique and informed insights into nature. We're not here to answer all the questions, but to ask better ones. So let's see what our artists have to say about Symbiosis, art's affinity with nature.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Symbiosis, Art's Affinity with Nature. I'm Melissa Fleming, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We'll be exploring artistic perceptions of nature and science with a particular emphasis on our changing climate. Now, while art and science are two different disciplines, they both share a sense of wonder. And using their own techniques, they both seek to understand and describe the world around us. And that's what we're going to be talking about today through the lens of the work of our three panelists. And they are Chantal Bilodeau, a playwright and artistic director of the Arctic Cycle, a group that uses theater to foster dialogue about climate change. We also have Cecil Howell, an artist and landscape architect with her own design studio called Object and Field. And we also have Ayo Okunsinda. He's an artist and assistant professor of interaction and media design at the Parsons School of Design. Now, if you want more details for each speaker, you can look on the Broto website for a longer bio for each person. Okay, so let's get started. First, we're going to have our three panelists share some slides and talk about their work. Then I'll ask some questions, and we'll have a question for the group to discuss at the end. Okay, so let's begin with Chantal.
Thank you, Melissa. I want to talk about a project, one particular project. I'm trained as a playwright, so my expertise is in storytelling. And at the Arctic Cycle, we have an ongoing project called Climate Change Theater Action, which we present every other year, with the next one coming in 2021. And as part of this project, we commissioned 50 playwrights to write a short play, 5 minutes long, about an aspect of climate change. And then based on a prompt, and then we take this collection of 50 plays and we make it available to people who were interested in organizing an event in their community within a 3-month time window that is in the fall, and that coincides with the United Nations COP meetings. Essentially, what we do, the purpose of this project is to put stories out into the world and to encourage people to gather around those stories and to have conversations about climate change. And the important part of that is that these stories are very personal. So this is not a conversation that happens around a scientific presentation, let's say, or a political rally or anything that is rooted in ideology, but it's more like people, playwrights trying to appeal to people's emotions and trying to connect more personally. One thing that's important, I think, about stories is that they can provide us a way to look through a different frame than science can. And one of the ways that this was made really obvious to me was, as a playwright, I have been working on a cycle of plays that look at the impact of climate change on the Arctic countries. And one of the first one I worked on actually was in Canada, because this is originally where I'm from. And when I started researching and then writing plays, a play about the Canadian Arctic, I was looking at sea ice because at the time, this is a play I wrote some years ago, but I was thinking about writing about the opening of the Northwest Passage. And in the end, I went in a different way, but that's the reason why I was looking specifically at sea ice. And what I learned is that in the course of doing my research and talking with people, with scientists, is that scientists rely on satellite pictures and data a lot to make their prediction about ice. So they have a big picture of what's going on. And actually, another interesting thing that I learned is that some of these scientists never even go to the Arctic. Their entire relationship with it is through satellite pictures. And on the other end of that, on the other spectrum, you have Inuit hunters. Inuit are the indigenous group that lives in the Canadian Arctic, who spend their lives on the ice and rely on it for hunting, to feed their families, and also for travel, because the communities are very isolated. And so the ice provides a way to get from one community to another. So they're very intimate with the ice's properties, and they know it up close. They're on it, they rely on it. It's part of their culture. And so what scientists have been doing is they have been coming up with ways to partner with Inuit and local residents to gather their stories and then to translate these stories into empirical science. So they try to understand what it is in the stories that science can extract and that can feed into their data. So that was a very profound experience for me, I guess, to really understand how stories can work. We know how they work on a personal level, but how they can also be useful to science. So our hope with climate change theater action is that these personal stories can highlight different communities' relationship to the environment. They can create a space also for voices that are not being often being heard, and they can build a bridge between the social and the natural sciences, and sometimes directly contribute to the natural sciences. In 2019, the last time we did climate change theater action, there were over 220 events held in 28 countries, so it's very global. And we stay in touch with the organizers, and throughout the process, we ask them for feedback. We ask them to send us photos and videos of their event. And so to give you a sense of the wide variety of events, I want to show you a short trailer that was made from the footage of the 2015 and 2017 events. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chantal. That was very interesting. Next, we have Cecil.
Great. Thank you. Alexander von Humboldt said, "What speaks to the soul escapes our measurements." And I think about this a lot as I try to grapple with the distance between scientific discovery and our cultural acceptance of science. My thesis here today is that the arts need to be meaningfully embedded in science in order to bridge this gap. So what follows are two projects I created this year that pair images with writings. Both projects ask how we can use art to enhance science with meaning, and how art can occupy that kind of muddy, ambiguous territory that both science and policy shy away from. This first project is a series of prints exploring the Flathead River in Montana, where I had the pleasure of being an artist in residence at the Flathead Lake Biological Station. The series capture an untrammeled 3-mile section of the Flathead River floodplain, which undulates dramatically with changing environmental factors. The Flathead Lake Biological Station used aerial photography and GIS to map the floodplain from 1945 until 2015. Using this data, I embossed each year of the river channel into paper and paired it with a monoprint of snow melting, which is the same process that feeds the Flathead River and therefore shapes the river. Iris Murdoch once said, "Beauty is that convenient and traditional name of something which art and nature share, and which gives a fairly clear sense to the idea of quality of experience and change of consciousness. I am looking out my window in an anxious and resentful state of mind, oblivious of my surroundings. Then suddenly I observe a hovering kestrel. In a moment, everything is altered. There's nothing now but kestrel. And when I return to thinking of the other matter, it seems less important." By this definition, beauty is not a state of being, but rather a relationship between two objects. It is also subject to timing, revealing itself with the flap of a wing and the shift of an eye. On the ground, a floodplain can be chaotic and confusing, with pockets of dense, scrubby vegetation, stretches of barren river rocks, and eddies of debris. Its beauty rests in the abundance of life it supports, not something easily captured by photography or understood with a cursory glance. And while we often rely on scenic vistas or distinct landforms to assess the value of a landscape, this approach obviously has its limits. It ignores landscapes, often vital ones, that don't appeal to our cursory glance and is at its core human-centered. Inspired by Murdoch's thoughts on beauty as a moment in time and as a dialogue between two objects, these pieces pair the aerial, scientific view of the landscape with the intimate process that shapes it. They're not data visualizations nor abstract art. There's something in that muddy middle. And now on to another project, which is a visual essay that was published recently in Burnaway magazine. And what follows is just a short excerpt from that publication. On February 25th, 2020, the Honorable Eugene E. Seiler heard the closing arguments from the states of Tennessee and Mississippi regarding a dispute over who owns the groundwater in the Middle Claiborne Aquifer, one layer in the larger Mississippi Embayment Aquifer system, a mushy layer cake of rocks and water that spreads underneath 7 states. Judge Seiler will send his recommendations on the ruling to the Supreme Court, making this the first groundwater case ever ruled on by our nation's highest court. While surface water use disputes are common, particularly in the arid West, this case is conceptually striking as it begs us to imagine ancient waters flowing below our terra firma, beneath our farms and cities, fashioning us as flotsam on this slushy substrate. The entire case of Mississippi versus Tennessee rests on the question of whether this invisible commodity is owned by whichever state it is under, or if it is an interstate resource and therefore governed, like many rivers, by the law of equitable apportionment, where each state is granted fair usage rights. Armed with the most basic knowledge of osmosis, it is hard to imagine how one state could assume ownership of groundwater, especially in an aquifer. But to some extent, I think that is the state of Mississippi's point. How do we carve up a system that is so interconnected? The unit of an aquifer may appear as a tangible object, but it is, as so many experts testified, connected to the aquifers above and below it, the surface streams, oceans, and ultimately the clouds above us. The arbitrary divisions of state lines have served as borders for many a complex system, so why not for this one as well? Translating complex systems such as aquifers into policy guidelines requires editing out nuances and drawing averages. This loss of intricacy occurs as one converts system to science and science to policy, which is then further warped by the intersections of history and culture. Compared to the complexity of reality, the language and laws we use to describe water appear alternately as humorous, poetic, or absurd. In Mississippi versus Tennessee, hydrological and geological experts testified for both sides, bringing their detailed knowledge of aquifers to bear upon the case. As court proceedings are recorded in text, the visuals that were presented to support the oral arguments were described in detail by these experts, adding another layer of distortion as image is rendered into word. These collages are my own interpretations of the phantom visuals and terms presented by the experts and lawyers on both sides of the case. The work is not an attempt to articulate anything factual or a winning argument, but rather draw out the ambiguities of the case using the language of law and mapping to explore the paradoxes and limits inherent to borders and ownership, especially when it comes to water. Again, the images in this work are based in research, but they are not didactic representations of that research. They offer, I hope, a means for us to see and feel the complexity and messiness that is edited out as we try to categorize, rationalize, and govern our environment. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Cecil. It's very interesting. Next up, we have Io.
Yeah, I want to start by this viral video that I saw a few days ago of this kid seeing a dragonfly and asking his mother if the dragonfly was a baby helicopter. And I was really struck by that because it means that within his own world, within his own epistemological framework, this dragonfly is not a dragonfly, right? This dragonfly is this baby mechanical thing, this baby thing about science and technology, and it struck me that real nature then becomes alien, becomes unrecognizable, and I think that in essence we've been doing that as humanity, sort of alienating nature. So in this talk, I want to talk about how we could look at alien ontologies, how we ourselves could alienate ourselves or to become the alien so that we could look within this episteme that we're in. So I do this by adopting speculative design practices where the idea is to sort of jump into the future, to jump into a particular dimension, and in that dimension find a problem, solve that problem, and then bring that problem to the present or to one's own particular space-time as a way of critique. So you could think about this by temporal forms, right? Jump into the past to elucidate the present, or jump into the future to elucidate the present. But also, it's not necessarily just temporal. You could think about this in terms of spiritual dimensions as well, or geographic dimensions as well. And the whole idea of this is to sort of think about the reason to do this is to think about ways to make stories, think about ways to tell stories as a way to critique things that are happening at present. So a lot of my work is influenced by, of course, Donna Haraway and Octavia Butler, and this practice of trying to live as the other, trying to alienate myself so that I could see where we are differently. So this project is called Zoomorphic. I did it with a friend of mine, Fito Segrera. And it's about thinking about a world where where the government has mandated that we live with animal species. So with this project, we decided to work with, we started out with ants, actually growing ants and having them do computation through systems that we created that would count them as they go about their world. And then that count then informs the computer systems that we wear. From that, we moved on to Drosophila and trying to think about, was there a way that we could genetically modify Drosophila so that our behavior and their genetics in the sense of blend together. So thinking about if we could modify them, for example, to migrate towards a particular space on our bodies that was warmer, or a particular space that had more food for them. What we ended up with was this project where we have Drosophila living within an ecosystem in a suit that as they moved around, we tracked them, and then their tracking then augmented the cameras. And by augmenting the cameras, it allows us to look at different spaces at the same time. So in essence, we're not seen through the eyes of the Drosophila, obviously, right? But we are being mediated by the behavior of the Drosophila. Yeah, this is the final headgear that goes with it. It was quite quite interesting because it sort of the camera view disorientates you, and it gives you this sense that you're living in a space, but you're seeing the space anew. You're seeing the space differently. And what we ask viewers that put this on to do is to think about, if that is your reality, how do you behave differently? How do you tell stories differently? How do you interact with others differently? How does what you know change? This other project is using slime mold as a way to teach, as a way to also try to, again, work with non-human species. So with this project with Ashley Lewis, we work with slime mold. And slime mold is an organism that is singular and multicellular at the same time. They have about 600 plus sexes. They can stretch out to optimize ways of acquiring food, and lots of experiments have been done on them to try to sort of optimize maps and basically use them as organic computational devices. So we wanted to experiment to see, was there a way that we could work with them? So again, thinking about not only working in communities of humans, but working in communities of non-human species as well. So with this, we developed a sensor that would detect the motion of the slime mold, where we'll put the slime mold in the center, and as they span outwards, they touch different panels, and then from that we could sense that, and we could trigger audio video recordings. So the way that we work with the slime mold is that we have a community come together. We have participants that create narratives, audio, visual, and images, and the slime mold then selects and mixes these audio video elements. And we have a camera as well that takes a photograph of them and sends them up. And then one last thing is this idea of, as we learn about as we do these experiments, we learn about these entities, we build electronics. We also want to work with communities, like educational communities like GenSpace, to educate people about the techniques that we use, right? So it's not only about working with these entities, but also providing access of information to others that might be interested in doing this type of work. Thank you.
Great. That was really, really interesting. Thank you, Ayo. So now we're going to have a question for each of you. I guess I'll go in the way we presented, so I'll start with Chantel. I'm curious how you research your work. Can you tell us a little bit about your travels to the Arctic and the idea of, or how the idea of being physically present there plays a part in your creative process?
Yeah, the Arctic is such a unique place that when I started writing plays about the Arctic, I had never been there, so it would not. I mean, before I started, so it would not. I would not have been able to do it justice, because I didn't know the people. I had never experienced the landscape, the climate. So when I do my research, it's part of it happens a little bit beforehand, where I talk to people, or if I know a little bit what I want to write about, I will pursue a particular subject and try to find the people who can help me understand it better. And then part of it is just being there and soaking in what's there. And in particularly about the Canadian Arctic, what I did when I was there was in 2009, and it was after there had been 2 international polar year pretty close together. People were tired of being studied. So what I did was, if anybody who was in a formal position, I would, make an appointment with them and tell them exactly what I was doing and seek information. And everybody else that I would encounter, I would just encounter them, as a tourist being there, and just talk to them so they wouldn't feel like I was trying to pry information out of them. And then, so this was the first play. I'm now on play number 3. There will be 8. And it's slightly different every time. The second play I wrote was in Norway. And, I've been living in the US for over 20 years. I'm originally from Canada. These are 2 countries I'm very familiar with. Norway, it was a completely new country. So I had to find my way in a way, and try to capture some of the essence of Norway without it seeing like I'm trying to speak for them, because clearly I can't. And now the third play, the one I'm working on at the moment, is based in the US. It's about Alaska. So it's a little bit, I'm giving myself a little bit of a break. It's a bit easier, and then I'll move on to another country I don't know and try to find my way in there.
Great. Very interesting. Okay. Cecil, you talked a lot about science, policy, and borders, and I understand you've been an artist in residence with the National Park Service. So I'm just wondering if the idea of public land has played a role in your work in any way, or what you think about that.
Yeah, very much so. I think as a landscape architect, I was working in public spaces for a while, and part of the reason I kind of wanted to get into the arts was that I wanted to have more questions about the ideas behind land rather than operating within the discipline of landscape architecture. And public land is a really good place to start that. We bring so many different myths and memories to it. And it's a really fascinating place to see how kind of the American ideals are played out. And getting to work in the national park was an exceptional way to study that. I was at Isle Royal, where they've introduced wolves recently, or reintroduced wolves. And there was a lot of sort of kind of crises of what a park is over that, because it had been a designated wilderness area, and that's a way of kind of interfering with the natural process of the land. And there's all these different people were kind of bringing their different ideas of what this place was to bear upon it. And the conversations between both the researchers and visitors was really fascinating to see how that played out.
I'm sure. Sounds really, really interesting. So Io, I was curious about your work. You talk a lot about the role of outside participants or community engagement. And I'm just wondering if you could talk more about how that plays a role in your work, especially in terms of our natural environment or our changing natural environment.
Yeah, definitely. So I always talk about this idea of you go to the state fair, right? And they have the jar of candy, and they ask you to count how many. And when you count, it's off, absolutely off. But then you have 1,000 people, and they count, and then you make the average, and then it's right on. I think about that as sort of a search for truth, right? And think about my artistic practice as this search for truth. If it's me doing that work, right, me disseminating my own ideas, it's kind of vapid and it's way off. But if I talk to the community, if I get a census of what people are feeling, the anxieties that they have, right, and if I could then create a platform to articulate their voices and surface that, it's a better articulation of the truth. Now, as to how that relates to the environment, how that relates to ecology, etc., I think this notion of who we are as humanity should be something that is inclusive of everybody, right? It's not about one government or a group of people that want a particular way forward, right? It's about the whole planet. And I think in the same way that sort of like at the county fair, you take the census of the whole, one should take the voices of the whole, and think about how as humans we could change the definition of what it is to be human, and to move forward. The idea of what a human is, there was no the category of human. It's a recent construction, and that construction right now is bloated, and it can't contain us anymore. And as a result of that, we're basically destroying the environment. How do we reconsider what that is? By taking the voices of everybody, but not only of humans, but also of non-human species and entities as well.
Great. So this next question is for the three of you to discuss. So everyone should be unmuted for that, hopefully. Basically, all of you have touched on the idea of time, space, and change in some way. So I want to focus on the time and space that we have in front of us, the future. And I'm curious how you see art, whether it be your own art or art in general, how you see that influencing or informing our global climate challenge as we move forward. We could start, if you want to start, Chantel, and then move along to Cecil and then Io, and then maybe you can just interact and discuss it amongst yourselves.
Well, several ways, I guess. The arts have had a tendency to be at the forefront of cultural movements, of big changes. They also facilitate transitions, huge social transitions. So I think there's definitely a role that the arts can play in this moment. It was interesting to see the Biden's agenda, which was made public after he got elected, that touches on these 4 pillars that I feel until now activists have been desperately trying to bring together, but they have been very separate, which is health, social and racial justice, the economy, and the environment. And that's also a way where I feel the arts can help make the links between these 4 pillars very evident, so we can understand that if you can't just touch this here and touch this here and hope that it will solve the problems, but you have to look at how all the things go together. And I feel like the arts are slowly, depending on the discipline, moving towards more existing outside of the confines of their disciplines. And so that's a way where it can be very powerful to, if the art itself exists outside of the discipline and can highlight the complexities and the interconnectedness of all these things, then hopefully that can help the broader population who engages with the arts to see the same things.
Yeah, I completely agree, Chantal. That's very well put. I referenced von Humboldt in my talk because he was somebody who so really believed that arts and sciences are the same thing, that it is this exploration for truth, and that the two of them are linked completely, and that we shouldn't disparage one in the pursuit of the other. And so I see now where we've gotten to this point where we're so clear on climate change, and our society is so far from understanding how to act towards that really is about that divergence between the two, and that we haven't addressed kind of the spirituality of science or the emotions of science well enough. And so that's where I think hopefully moving forward that we can have more of those conversations. I also think that there's this, artists have this ability to test things that scientists have to be much more rigid about. They can occupy these kind of fringe territories that Chantal kind of was getting at, that I think it's really cool to see collaborations that can happen where the artists can push things in a different way than science and more formal studies can.
Yeah, I would like to push against the notion. Melissa, you said something about the future in front of us, right? I don't know if that's is necessarily true. I think that we live in a world where there is this acceptance of a sort of linear time scale, right? Acceptance of progress, and I think perhaps to be able to do what we need to do next, right? We need to abandon certain frameworks, right? If we think, for example, the second 100, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, the second did not exist. 1,000 years ago, literally a minute did not exist. So we're talking about time as if it is something that is I feel that time is a discursive subject, right? And if we lean towards that idea of time not necessarily being attached to quote unquote progress, attached to rationality, and maybe then we could start understanding a little bit about how we can creatively combine these or find solutions to these combined problems that we have. I think part of it is the need for us to reorder the way we think about a lot of frameworks that at current we take for granted.
Okay. You guys want to jump in? Have any comments?
I completely agree, Io, and I'm kind of wondering how you practically address that within your artwork, because it seems to me so tricky to get beyond time with anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one way of doing it is if one thinks about the proliferation of timepieces, right? Clocks and wristwatches are everywhere, and they work for a particular time. Right? Imagine now a watch that speeds up or slows down based on certain emotional things that are happening, right? And then now imagine that watch proliferating over everywhere, and now everybody has a different it has a different sense. Time then has a different sensibility, right? Or a friend of mine, Tiga Brain, has a clock that it is mapped to the flowers that season. And I have another friend that has a clock that literally releases scents, and based on that you have to smell what time it is. So I think the ability to recognize that some of these structures that we have are contingent, right? And if they are, then we could think about the wicked problems as being contingent, right? And then as a result of that, we could slowly start to manipulate them.
Chantel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, building on what you said, Io, it would be so interesting, if we each had, or if time sped or contracted, depending on how we feel, and if we could experience how somebody else's time, what happens if I feel like speeding up and you need to slow down? I think it would create a very different relationship, and we would learn something very profound about each other.
Yeah, I think now if we attach that idea of time to progress, to the idea of progress, and thinking about, let's say, the cotton gin, for example, and how the cotton gin was this scientific progress, right? But then, and it was efficient, and it was good, but then it necessitated more production of cotton, and because of that, it required more slaves. So right there, the idea of progress manifested in this object became something that was detrimental to a group of people, right? So if we think about time, if we think about the ability to understand how others exist in time, right, then we might be able to understand, okay, maybe the CO2 emissions that we're doing as a consequence of progress doesn't relate to others that might be experiencing coastal flooding, right?
Yeah, these are all excellent points. And I think it's something we can continue discussing, but I think our time is up. But we'll continue this in the live section, and I hope we'll get more questions from our outside audience. But I just want to thank you all for sharing your work and your ideas with us today. And for the audience that's watching at home, you can find more climate-related art in the Symbiosis Art Exhibition, which is happening online in conjunction with this conference. And if you go to the Broto website listed on the screen below, you can see more there and learn more about that. But on that note, we need to wrap up. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so hello everyone. I hope you enjoyed the presentations and discussions you just saw. We recorded that a few weeks ago, and now this is the live Q&A session. So feel free to send in your questions using the box on the side of the screen. And it looks like we have a few questions coming in already, so let's get started. It looks like people are very interested in the idea of something Cecil mentioned, the spirituality of science, and they would like to hear the panel, in their words, unpack that idea or just discuss that idea more generally.
Yeah, the idea of the spirituality of science, I think that where I see that coming from, it's sort of at a deeply personal level, in that I think we're intent in trying to find meaning through science, and that is like a very excellent pursuit. But there's also this ability to absorb meaning in a very spiritual way, and we need to recognize that those two things can coexist, and that one doesn't deny the other, and that combined, that they both have like a sort of an amplifying effect of meaning. And so that's kind of where I see working, is trying to find that edge, and bringing that into the public discussion a little bit more. What about you, Chantel or Ayo?
Yeah, I love what you said, Cecil. I would add that I see the world as a spiritual place, and science as showing us even more of the mystery, right? Even more of the spirituality. It's a tool to understand all the things that we can't understand. And so I've always been fascinated. I used to read books some years ago about quantum physics, and a lot of the scientists would express that the more they studied, the more they learned, the more they felt like there was a huge spiritual component to life.
Yeah. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah. I think definitely, even in terms of the practice of science, right? The need to sort of, I always think about Max Weber and science as a vocation, or there's always it has to be more than just you wanted to do the work, right? It has to be, it's part of your soul. It's part of who you are in essence, right? And I think that that connection between science and spirituality absolutely exists. But I would also say that it's not just, obviously, it's not just existent within science, right? That idea of spirituality and one's vocation exists in arts, exists everywhere as well. So in a sense, there is this, one can think about all the vocations having this spiritual essence that sort of propel them forward.
Okay, so we have another question coming in for Chantel. They say, can you please say more about your theater pieces? Do you use verbatim stories from your participants in the works?
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure which one of the theater pieces you're referring to, so I'll answer for both. In my own plays, it's not verbatim. Very often, I say that I write fact-based fiction. So very often I will take some of the stories that people give me, combine them or assign them to a different character, or use part of it and then add some things from my own imagination. And then in the climate change theater action, where we commission playwrights to write stories, I don't think it's happened that somebody has written verbatim, but it's certainly, if somebody wanted to do that, it would certainly be welcome. I guess the goal is not, there's definitely a place for those stories. It's not what we tend to do. So our goal is more to capture the poetry and the personal resonance of a story, rather than simply communicate somebody's direct experience.
Chantel, do you ever use the people who are telling you the stories as actors in the play?
No, it's never happened. No.
Okay, it looks like we have another question coming in for Chantel. They want to know about your new book.
Yeah, okay. So lighting the way. So at the end of every climate change theater action, we publish all the plays together in an anthology, so they can keep circulating and people can have access to them, study them in classes, read them. The first one was called "Where's the Hope," and then which was the plays of 2017, and the plays from the 2019 event are in a book called Lighting the Way, an anthology of short plays about the climate crisis. And it just got published. It's available in paperback on Amazon, and the ebook is about to be available too.
We have another question about the third paradise that people want to know more about. So feel free to jump in, anybody, to talk about that or how it relates to your work.
I'm assuming that is sort of, this notion that I guess science and art are different paradises, and then the combination would be considered the third paradise. I'm not quite sure if that's the meaning of that title, but for me, it's always been, I've always found it necessary to try to exploring truth, not either from just an art perspective, not either just from a science perspective, but understanding that they both have things to inform each other. And so the confluence of the synthesis of both practices, for me, I find it as the most relevant way to explore.
Similarly, I actually am not familiar with that term. So I'm assuming it is that kind of place where, if they say it's a third place, right? When you're talking about spaces, a new way of defining those two fields coming together. I see it that way, but I also see it as kind of a dissolving of those boundaries as well. So, and I had this, so as I showed in the presentation, I had a stint where I stayed at the Flathead Lake Biological Center, and that's where a bunch of scientists work. And then I was staying in one of their little cabins and just got to participate in that exchange. And it felt much more organic than like creating a separate space where we operated, but where I could just like kind of walk into offices, ask questions, have them ask questions of me. And there started to be a real dialogue there. So I think that there's a lot of room for that to happen in the future, whether it's, artists or writers, anybody that can kind of think in a slightly different way. And also so much of science is routine and practicing things, consistently. And I think that there's a nice way that art can operate in a different function, but within the same like office or research laboratory.
I'm going to just jump in and address Rich's question of ontologies and narratives. For me, I grew up in different parts of the world, traveled to many countries, and everywhere that I go, people understand the world differently. They and through the understanding of the world, through their cosmologies, they behave differently. They are different, right? Different in ways that are absolutely fascinating and absolutely interesting, but that may be seen as other, if one doesn't understand that there is a plethora of ways to be as a human being. So for me, the ability to tell stories, right, to create narratives is a way to give a little opening into other ways of being. So for example, I have a spacesuit that I wear as the astronaut, this African astronaut that comes from a different time and space. And I move around the city in this suit. It gives me water, it gives me air. It does audio video recording. And in a sense, it others me, right? It alienates me. But at the same time, it gives a little avenue, a little space for others to see a different way of being. And by seeing different ways of being, and this is just anecdotal from my experience, by having experienced all the places I've been, I've traveled, all the cultures, I think there is understanding that there is connectivity between all of that. And maybe through these narratives and through providing alternate views of ways of humans can be, others could understand that there are all these connections. I hope that addressed the question.
Okay, now we have a question from Ian. He has a specific question for Cecil. He wants to know, is there specific knowledge about nature that you've learned through art that you wouldn't have through landscape science?
Yes, very much, and also just kind of through practice too. I think that design operates from sort of a more rigid structure and a formality, and the poetry that can be found in art operates in this very intuitive way. And I think that that's sort of where maybe this comes back to the spirituality of science part, where the intuitive aspects of art have allowed me to immerse myself in landscape in a very different way than approaching it as a designer or when I was a student as an ecologist. So I really appreciate that ability that it lets me start to see. And I feel like I can feel my brain switching between the different modes of approaching a place. I'm sure you guys have that as well. And that like kind of much more sensory experience is something that I've really learned to appreciate through art.
Okay, so we have another question for Io. The question is, Io, has the pandemic manipulated our concept or relationship to time?
Yes. In the before days, you'll have a meeting and you'll say, okay, I can't make it to the meeting. I'm stuck in the subway. And everybody is like, yeah, of course, you're stuck in the subway. Now, every Zoom meeting, you have about 3 seconds to move from one to the other. So in that sense, yes, absolutely. It's frustrated me because it seems as if it's actually created more time to then to stress my body, right? But in other ways too, it's sort of elongating time, and then in other ways too, it's about this duress, right? Of prolonging pain, right? Not just this idea of violent incident that happens at a particular moment. It sort of stretches out the stress and the pain so long. So yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's what I'm writing about now for my I'm writing some papers on time and blackness, black temporalities, and how the pandemic has affected that. And yeah, absolutely.
The time has come to start wrapping up the panel. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing your work and ideas, and also thank the audience for your questions and participation. I also want to remind the viewers to check out the Symbiosis Art Exhibition, which is happening online in conjunction with this conference, and you can go to the Broto website to see more about that. So thank you, everyone, and be well.